Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. This year, around Hanukkah time, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about an interesting notion of the Jewish rediscovery of Hanukkah. Obviously, I have to put the word or the prefix re in parentheses because Jews were always aware of Hanukkah. However, it's fascinating to note that the actual history of Hanukkah took many centuries to kind of, uh, peel off like the skin of an onion. And we had a very basic kind of understanding what Hanukkah was from our most essential sources, but it is only with the passage of time that Jews have come back to the holiday of Hanukkah and really tried to understand much of its historical basis. This really gives me a lot of pride as a historian because I feel like I've somehow contributed to the understanding, or at least, within the context of all Jewish historians, I've somehow contributed on a professional level to helping us understand what actually happened back in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Let's have a look at the sources. So how do we know about Hanukkah? I mean, Jewishly. So the Talmud is perhaps the most important source that we have for the history of Hanukkah, at least for much of the medieval period. The Talmud, of course, was redacted to the form that we have today, although there's some dispute about this, but probably in the 5th century. And there is a section in the tractate Shabbat that talks about the miracle of Hanukkah, the rebellion of the Maccabees, and so on. It is not, however, really focused on the history, and it gives us very little detail as to why did the Jews rebel? Who was Antiochus? What was going on there? And certainly doesn't give us any of the blow-by-blow events of this rebellion, which actually took several years to completely unfold. We have a little bit more detail in a document called the Yiddish Edition, the Scroll of Fasts, which is a 2nd century document, quite fascinating, that lists a whole bunch of days in the Jewish calendar upon which it is not permitted to fast because they are great celebrations, and other days which of course are fast days. There's also a later addition to the Scroll of Fast, which was probably written around the 5th century. It's called the Scholium, and it gives us just a little bit more detail about the entire Maccabean rebellion, but not enough to really satisfy those of us that have a historical curiosity. There is one other really important document from late antiquity that is still studied today, the so-called Scroll of Antiochus, also known in the medieval period as the Scroll of the Sons of the Hashmonaim, the sons of the Hasmoneans. And it was probably written between the 2nd and the 5th century. It's first mentioned in another source in the year 615 and then discussed to a certain degree in the Gaonic period. But the problem with the Scroll of Antiochus is not quite the same kind of problem that we have with the Talmud and the Megillas Tainus, in that there's not a lot of detail. In the Scroll of Antiochus, there's lots of detail, but it's almost completely erroneous or fabricated. It does not seem to correspond to any of the material that we have from many other much more reliable contemporary sources. So in terms of understanding what exactly happened in the events of the Maccabean rebellion, it's not especially helpful. What is especially helpful is if you go back to early sources that are contemporary to the account. Perhaps the most important of these is a book called the Book of the Maccabees. Now, there are actually several books of the Maccabees, and the first book in particular is especially valuable because it was likely written by a Jewish individual who was embedded in the actual revolt itself and was able to report on the unfolding of events from a first-person perspective. Incredibly valuable, very well written actually for an ancient document. It has a lot of drama to it and so on. So how come Jews aren't studying this? Well, this book of the Maccabees ended up in a collection which was later called the Apocrypha. These are books that the rabbis, for one reason or another, decided not to include in the Bible, in the Tanakh. There are lots of these works that are floating around the ancient world, written by different people with different perspectives, and the rabbis, as they are slowly developing the canon of what we would call the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, they decided to pass on the Book of the Maccabees. There are several others that are discussed in the Talmud, for example, references to Ben Sira and other important, fascinating works. So they were set aside. The Christian world, however, picked these books up in Greek translation and preserve them at the back of the Christian Bibles. So there's a whole section, for example, if you look at a Catholic Bible, that has all these really unusual works of historical significance, often wildly unreliable, with the exception for our purposes of the first book of Maccabees, which is very useful. And they tell us a lot about life in ancient Israel. So from a religious perspective, these are definitely not canonical, but from a historical perspective, they are fair game. And the book of the Maccabees gives us a lot more detail about what's going on in the Jews' life during the period of the Hashmonaim rebellion. Now, another very important source, also roughly contemporary, is of course Josephus. Very fascinating individual. We've spoken about him many times on my channel. He was a Jewish member of the rebellion against the Romans in the first century, in the disastrous First Roman-Jewish War, which ultimately resulted in the destruction of the temple. But Josephus, seeing that he was about to be conquered and killed, decided to switch sides, and he joined the Romans. He turned out to be a very valuable translator and culture broker for the Romans. And after the rebellion had ended with the defeat of the Jews in their native land, Josephus went on to a really illustrious career as essentially a court historian. He was extremely prolific, wrote a massive multi-volume Antiquities of the Jews, which is essentially a history of the Jews since Genesis, and he wrote a very important book on the war itself, our go-to source for the Roman-Jewish War. Now, he's a problematic figure in many ways. As I've just mentioned, he switched sides from the Jewish rebels to the Roman conquerors, and we don't know a lot about what he actually thought, what he would have said about the war to Jews, because the only works that have survived of Josephus's are in Greek. That was like the language of the educated classes at the time. And the version, for example, of the Jewish War that he wrote in Aramaic has been lost. So we don't know how he would have explained his position to a Jewish audience. But to the broader audience, he essentially tells everything about Jewish history to Romans and Greeks and anyone else who is fascinated in knowing more about the Jewish people. And Josephus gives us a lot of history about the Maccabees, much of which, fits with the description in First Maccabees, and we learn a lot more about the war itself, why it happened, its unfolding, and its denouement, and so on. And we've talked about those in other videos. I'm not going to about them today. So what's going on here is that you have the inside Jewish account of Chanukah, which is really focused on things like the menorah and the miracle of the 8 days, and has a very superficial historical account of why the Jews were rebelling in the first place, and how the war unfolded, and how it ended, and how we had, a Maccabean rebellion. Part of the reason why it seems the rabbis who were in charge of kind of collecting this for posterity and for Jewish memory is that they're not entirely enthusiastic about the kingdom that was formed after the Maccabean rebellion. The Hashmonaim were not always so when it came to their attention to rabbinic halacha. Also issues with regards the following Herodian dynasty, which is even more problematic. But at any rate, the rabbis elected to not put too much emphasis on the history, but we do have the history preserved, ironically, in Christian and in Roman collections. So this begins to come together in the 10th century in southern Italy, where there was a large Jewish population. And here you have an author who puts together a book called Sefer Yossippon. Yossippon is clearly derived from Josephus, and although the author made some really egregious errors, like calling Josephus son of Gurion, when we know that his father's name was Matisyahu. I mean, it's unusual, but nevertheless, it's kind of like an adaptation of Josephus for a Jewish audience now. First time publicly talking about the kind of sources that that would have been much more popular among Christians and would have been much more available to professional historians. The only problem, well, one of most important problems of Sefer Yossippon is that the author did not know any Greek, so he couldn't read Josephus in the original. He relied on a Latin translation, which was not the best translation, and it was also partial. He didn't have access to the entire corpus of Josephus's works, and he actually wrote quite a bit in several different places about the rebellion that we're discussing. But he also had the Apocrypha. He had the Latin translation of the book of Maccabees. So it's only in the 10th century when we get to, Jews actually, historians looking back and saying, wow, this is such a fascinating story. Why don't we know more about it? And then going in and looking at these other sources and filling in, putting flesh on the bones of the story that we have in the Talmud and giving us a much more robust picture of what's going on. There are many errors in Yossippon because of the fragmentary nature of the sources that he was working with, but nevertheless, a huge leap forward in Jewish self-understanding of the history of the Maccabees. So much so that Yossippon is still studied to this day, including this amazing Yiddish edition that came out in 2020. It's a multi-volume edition, so fascinating that all kinds of Jews are still studying Sefer Yossippon, this 10th century adaptation of a first century work written by Josephus. Now, I'd like to bring this together with a little bit of a Dvar Torah because this is for my community at Young Israel of Lawrence-Cedarhurst, and it brings to mind something that Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory once wrote. He really emphasized the importance of creating a narrative or working with the narratives as a form of moral education, not only for Jews, but for the broader world as a whole. Rabbi Sacks really emphasized how as long as Jews are understanding of their own story and are able to communicate it to themselves, that story has tremendous implications for the entire world. So here's a citation. I'm going to read it to you from something he wrote in 2015. It's from Telling the Story, commentary on Parshas Bo. So this is Rabbi Sacks writing. God created man, Elie Wiesel once wrote, because God loves stories. What other cultures have done through systems, Jews have done through stories. And in Judaism, the stories are not engraved in stone or memorials, magnificent though that is. They are told at home, around the table, from parents to children, as the gift of the past to the future. That is how storytelling in Judaism was devolved, domesticated, and democratized. Then he goes on after a slight break. There are stories that ennoble and others that stultify, leaving us prisoners of ancient grievances or impossible ambitions. The Jewish story is in its way the oldest of all, yet ever young, and we are each a part of it. It tells us who we are and who our ancestors hoped we would be. Storytelling is the great vehicle of moral education. It was the Torah's insight that a people who told their children the story of freedom and its responsibilities would stay free for as long as humankind lives and breathes and hopes. So in that regard, I hope you have a freilichen und lichtigen Chanukah, a Chanukah full of happiness and light, and I hope that we all merit to share the story and delve deeper into the story for the next generation and for humanity as a whole. Thank you very much for listening.